Hello and welcome to the final lesson on Late Night Woman's Hour, the Component 1 Section B media product. Whilst we've looked at quite a lot to do with contexts, industries and audiences over the previous two sessions, I wanted to just detach this one specifically to look at some application of the theoretical framework, which of course is really important in both component 1 and 2 of the media studies course. But hopefully the stuff that you've learned and the episodes of Late Night Woman's Hour that you've listened to will help you do this fairly easily. But in terms of what we're hoping to do by the end of this session is, of course, apply theories of industry, looking at Curran and Seaton, and apply Hall's encoding-decoding model as our audience theory. So let's start with those industry theories, in particular Curran and Seaton's power and media industries, based on their book Power Without Responsibility. As we know in the theoretical framework, the main points that are highlighted are, number one, the idea that media are controlled by a small number of companies, primarily driven by the logic of profit and power. They go on to use this fact to suggest that, 2, the idea that media concentration, generally speaking, limits or inhibits variety, creativity and quality. And they also use this second point to move on to a sort of third idea that more socially diverse patterns of ownership help to create the conditions for more varied and adventurous media productions. So it's very easy to kind of prove point number 1, I suppose. Just have a look online, do a little bit of Googling, and you'll find that so few companies own so much of the media out there is probably proof of the first point. It's something that's constantly sort of shifting and changing within quite narrow parameters. But we've watched videos and we've looked at the idea that maybe it's only 5 or 6 companies that are actually responsible for 90% of the media output on planet Earth, which is really quite shocking in an era whereby so much of the content is perhaps produced by the users as well. It just gives you an idea of how powerful those corporations are. I say 5 or 6, it sounds a little vague, but obviously the way that companies like Disney maneuver, Comcast, these big conglomerates, they're frequently taking over and merging with different companies and so on. So at time of recording, it's always difficult to say exactly, but it's a handful of companies that own the 90% or the vast majority of the world's media production. I suppose there's a possibility you could argue that that these companies are driven by a logic of profit and power, but that's quite an argument to make, isn't it? If you can think of any examples of companies, I've just mentioned 2 there, Comcast and Disney, but there are and others. But of course, what we want to think of is that organisations that prove these points and then apply this to Late Night Woman's Hour. So what could we say about Late Night Woman's Hour in relation to this theory? Does it prove point number 2 or does it prove point number 3? What makes this slightly interesting and maybe muddies the water slightly is that the BBC is a big organisation. What you have to think about, though, is who owns the BBC or who is responsible for its ownership, okay, as to whether you decide that Late Night Woman's Hour proves point number 2 or point number 3. And some of it will come down to your own opinions as well. Anyway, make some notes, think about what you've listened to in terms of our 2 set episodes. Remember the first one we listened to was all about Love Island with Emma Barnett hosting, and the second one was the episode all about the Danish concept of hygge, hosted by Lauren Laverne, called Home. Take some time, make some notes, and we'll have a look at this. Well, as I said, this is quite a strange question or slightly tricky question to answer because of the size of the BBC. However, if you consider the BBC's ownership, essentially it is owned by us, the people, the populace, then it is probably an example of point 3 rather than point 2. What also muddies this, of course, is slightly to do with your own opinions on the show. I suppose I feel that this is an example of point 3, first of all because Late Night Woman's Hour technically does have a socially diverse pattern of ownership because the licence fee payers in the UK come from all different backgrounds, from different patterns, if you like, socially diverse patterns. There is an encouragement to engage with the license fee, whether you are no matter what your age, gender, ethnicity, nationality, whether you're from what part of the country you're from, disability, all of these kind of things suggest that the BBC is owned by an incredibly diverse range of people, first off. And second of all, do you feel that it creates the conditions for more varied and adventurous media productions? Well, that's only proved if you feel that Late Night Woman's Hour does provide more varied and adventurous content, more diverse content. I would argue that it does, but don't take my word for it. Let's see if you can prove it yourself. So my second question for this, to apply the theory properly, I would like you to do some research into the other episodes of Late Night Woman's Hour and listen to an episode. That's always makes sense. I'd like you to make notes on the show that adds evidence to the idea that the show is kind of free to discuss what it wants in whatever way it wants and celebrates diversity. How also can you say that how do we know that this is a show that's free from commercial ties? Okay, have a think, make some notes on this whilst listening to another episode, and we'll have a look at this in just a second. Well, whichever episode you listen to, hopefully you were able to find some examples, or looking through the sort of the list of different episodes and subject matters, and also guests should help you see that as well. If we think about our own set products, of course, the shows themselves do discuss a sort of diverse range of topics, ranging from perhaps the kind of highbrow and intellectual approach to deconstructing a concept like hygge, to looking at something incredibly pop culture like Love Island. If we think about the different guests that were on the show, we can say that this definitely celebrates diversity in the range of not only ethnicity in terms of the different guests that appear, but also intellectually, also nationally as well. If you remember, Trina Hahnemann, the Danish chef, appears on The Home. We get a real variety on there, and that they're encouraged to, the guests are encouraged to put forward their point of view as well. And as we said, whilst this does have a kind of highbrow approach and intellectual approach, this show has tried to target a slightly younger audience than its mother show, shall we say, of Woman's Hour. Whether you feel that it did that would have been answered in the previous lesson. But there we go, a couple of ways of applying Curran Seaton's model by considering the ownership of the BBC, which is varied and diverse because it's owned by all of us. And does it prove point 3? Well, possibly if we look at the variety and the content, and the fact that this is a podcast which maybe does try and do things with its content that is untypical to maybe other radio shows in some ways. Okay, let's move on. There is a second industry element that we need to consider before we move on to audience, and that's regulation. So I've just put up on screen here the regulation information that you had from the previous session. Ofcom is the regulator for radio. I've just included in this panel the different role that Ofcom has regarding broadcasting. Just a quick reminder as well that the BBC is self-regulating. It should actually, in technically speaking, not require Ofcom, although of course people are free to make complaints if they wish, if they feel that the broadcaster has kind of overstepped the mark or is contravening Ofcom's rules in any way. How does this fit into the theoretical framework? Well, we have two theorists, one theory on this. It's Livingston and Lunt. They are part of the theoretical framework. And as such, the specification summarises their work into the two following points. First one being that the idea that there is an underlying struggle in recent UK regulation policy between the need to further the interests of citizens by offering protection from harmful offensive material, and by the interests of consumers by ensuring choice, value for money, and market competition. So this is kind of two arguments thrown into one, really, I suppose. First one is, I suppose, the age-old argument when it comes to regulation to do with censorship versus freedom of speech. That struggle between a government or a regulator's desire to protect people from being harmed or offended, or to be discriminated against by media products, versus the fact that we do have a kind of strong sense of a freedom of speech and a freedom of press and freedom of expression in our nation. We're not the only country that believes in these values, but it's something that we're sort of very proud of. So there will always be a tension between the idea that you don't want to discriminate or objectify or marginalise groups with media products, but at the same time you don't want to impinge on people's freedom to have an expression. That's the point that they're saying there. The second strand, if you like, of this idea is also the fact that it's that idea that there should be a freedom of expression amongst commercial broadcasters and commercial entities. So I suppose in the UK we celebrate the commercial freedom of different enterprises. We have a number of different media, tons of media organisations that are out there producing media content for their own profit. We have a number of different broadcasters that do that, okay? And I suppose that is slightly, not in conflict with, but I suppose an opposition to the notion of public service broadcasting. The fact that public service broadcasting is there for the betterment of society. It is a service to make our society richer, whether that's through education, information or entertainment. And so, again, regulation is a factor which comes between those two things. How much is media there to make the society better, and how much should media be there to gain more and more money for its shareholders? The second point that Livingston and Lunt make is the idea that increasing power of global media corporations, together with the rise of convergent media technologies and transformations in the production, distribution and marketing of digital media, have placed traditional approaches to media regulation at risk. Okay, it's quite a long sentence, but to unpick it, we're looking at the fact that the internet has made everything all a bit foggy. The internet and the way that media industries are now converging with one another, the fact that media corporations are getting bigger, and as we mentioned with Curran Seaton, maybe conglomerates are now less easy to define, just makes the whole traditional notion of regulation all a bit fuzzy. Particularly as the internet is a space which is considered to be a champion of free speech, the fact that as users and audience members we can create so much of our own content almost from scratch. We don't have to rely on hosting sites, whether that's YouTube or Facebook or whatever. The internet provides us with the powers to have our own say in whichever way we want to. We know this because of the rise of a number of independent news providers and what has become a battle, I suppose, between mainstream media and independent media. But basically speaking, their point here is, I guess, to maybe oversimplify it, that the internet and the way that companies now organise themselves puts traditional notions, traditional ideas of how do you regulate media just that bit more confusing. So, how can we relate some of these ideas to the regulation of radio and how online podcasting has changed the nature of regulation? Do some research, have some thoughts, think about what we've listened to in the show that we're studying, our set product, and get your notes down on this. Okay, we'll move on from media industries to media audiences. And the theory we need to think about specifically in regard to media audiences and late night women's hour is Stuart Hall's encoding decoding model, which shouldn't be too tricky. It's a theory that we know very well. We use it to analyse most media products. Of course, we looked at audiences for our advertising scheme of work as well. So we looked at it for those three media products in that part of section A. As we know, Hall asserted that communication is a process involving encoding by the producers, people who create the media, do so with meaning intended and embedded into it, and then decoded by audiences, which of course means that an audience does not necessarily have to decode the intended meaning from the media product. That doesn't mean that there is an infinite amount of ways of reading a media product or understanding it. In fact, Hall said that there are 3 ways in which the messages and meanings could be decoded by audiences. The first one he refers to as the dominant or preferred, or sometimes referenced as the hegemonic position, where the audience accepts the intended meaning of the encoded product. The second one is the negotiated position, where the audience acknowledges some of the messages encoded by the producers of the product, but may actually question or even adapt the message to be more relatable to their own experiences, so a kind of in-between position. And the last one is the oppositional position, which is where the decoder, the audience does understand the intended reading, but disagrees with it. It's not simply a case of disliking a media product, it is appreciating what was intended, but realise it not agreeing with that ideological output. So, a few questions to answer on this. First of all, what are the ideologies of Late Night Women's Hour? In other words, what is the dominant reading of the product or preferred reading? So take a moment now to just scribble down, you could probably do this in 4 or 5 bullet points, what ideologies would you say are there about this show, this radio show? What does it celebrate? What does it value? What does it champion? What does it want its audiences to engage with? Okay, so put this in sort of 4 or 5 bullet points. Well, hopefully you had a sort of variety of things. In fact, probably found this difficult to keep it down to 5 bullet points. But you could talk about the idea of a celebration of intellectualism, I think is a really important part of this. I think that the show definitely values a unity in ideas, and that it actually is a show which values differing points of views and perspectives. It's a show that suggests everyone has got something to bring to a conversation. I think it's a show which celebrates an educated and academic approach to different subject matters, but at the same time, I think it also sees value in not only the highbrow, but also popular culture. This is a show which is equally as comfortable talking about philosophical, sociological, psychological concepts as it is talking about TV shows, pop music, the things that we consume every day. I would argue, and some of you may have argued this as well, that there are feminist ideologies within this show. It's a show which celebrates independent, interesting, and I suppose a diverse array of female voices from a different spectrum. And on that note, I would say that the show celebrates a diversity as well. There are a number of different ideas you could bring into that. These are just some of the, I suppose, the ideologies of the show. Okay, so my next question may be predictable, but what factors might determine whether someone would take a negotiated or an oppositional reading? I'm going to throw you a hint here. When we looked at Hall's theory, we considered the idea that there are a few different ways that might determine whether someone took a negotiated or oppositional reading. And I want you to consider from these different perspectives. The first one was cultural experience, okay? The second one was gender, all right? And that's not just as simple as saying, well, it doesn't target me, therefore I will take an oppositional reading. It's a bit more nuanced than that. And the third one is situated culture, which is, of course, related to what David Morley refers to as the politics of the living room, to do with where you are, what you're doing, etc., which, of course, is really significant for a radio show or even a podcast. So have a think about those 3 ideas. Make a short list of different factors which might determine whether or not someone would take a negotiated or an oppositional reading. Okay, well, there are numerous things there. Hopefully you avoided the pitfall of looking at gender as simply something saying, well, if I'm a man then it doesn't target me, then I won't be interested. Because, of course, many of the topics are interesting regardless of your gender. For example, the episode on home and hygge is something that I've listened to numerous times. I always find it interesting from a socially historical perspective, the fact that it just gives us this potted history of what home is and so on and so forth. And that's probably the reason I'm able to be interested in that, is because of an identification point. My position at the point of time I am in my life and my cultural experiences are now of one setting up home, of being interested in domesticity, as boring as that might sound, but that's why I kind of identify with that show. If I don't perhaps take as much interest in the show on Love Island, it's because I'm not a regular viewer of that. However, I did find that particular show interesting. The interesting thing with gender, as why someone might take a negotiated or oppositional reading, is often to do with identification. Some male audiences may feel that they are less able to identify with certain factors because when the shows talk about the experience of being a woman. So perhaps some of the ideas that are discussed regarding social media and pressures on being a woman in the show about Love Island, or perhaps some of the ideas relating to home are less relatable for myself as a male audience, and therefore might cause a negotiated reading in some way. In terms of cultural experiences, again, if you ideologically oppose to the idea of turning something freedom of speech or diversity, then perhaps you'd be opposed to this show, but I don't suppose you'd listen in the first place. Maybe a couple of negotiated or oppositional readings might be to do with whether you feel that Love Island, for example, is worthy of intellectual discussion, or whether it's flogging a dead horse, or whether you feel that something like home and domesticity, the subject of the other episode hosted by Lauren Laverne, is actually maybe slightly stereotypical thing for a panel of women to discuss. So there are different reasons why you might. Situated culture is a really interesting one. Listening to podcasts, where you are, how you're listening to it, you might find that if it's just on in the background whilst you're doing other tasks, then perhaps you don't fully appreciate the conversation and so on and so forth. There are a number of different factors which could affect or have an impact on how you understand the show based on where you are and what you're doing at the time. I've got a reading here from the show from the Spectator magazine. What I'd like to do is in the document below, I'd like to have a read. It's only very short, and find some evidence which proves what kind of reading the journalist has taken. Have they taken the preferred, the oppositional, or have they taken a negotiated reading to the text? So have a read of the article and provide some evidence. And then finally, I'd like you to research some actual responses to Late Night Woman's Hour. Find some more reviews of the show if you can. There are some out there. These can be from professional magazines and proper review sites. They can be from people's blogs. They can just be posts on social media. Scour the social media, searching for any information you can on Late Night Woman's Hour that shows how people have responded to this. Blogs and videos, anything. Decide what readings have been taken and put together a collection of quotations about the show, and you analyse what the audience member has taken from it. Have they made a preferred reading? Have they made a negotiated reading? Or have they taken an oppositional reading? Stick them in your answers below. Okay, and that concludes the lesson on theory. Application of theory is really important for all of the products that we look at here, but these are just some for that component 1 section B, audiences and industries. Thanks very much.